My name is Caitlin Johnson, and this is my tort law video for EDL 850. Tort law is having to do with a tort, which is a wrong that can be compensated, usually in the form of damages, which is usually in the form of money. There can be intentional torts, which is an offense committed by somebody who intended to do harm, or there can also be negligence torts, which is what happens when someone fails to uphold the standard of care expected from someone of their profession. And this is usually the one that educators are going to be dealing with if they have to deal with tort lawsuits. The first case that I found was Frame versus Como. In this case, the student sustained an injury as a result of his movement and the movement of the teacher. When the student was exiting the classroom, the teacher moved to grab his arm, and the student, as a result, fell into a podium in the classroom. The reactive measures would be to ensure that the student receives the proper medical attention necessary as soon as possible, as well as to separate the student and teacher. The proactive measures our school would take would be to ensure that no teacher physically moves the student unless there is obvious imminent danger, because most of us as professionals are not trained to be moving students at all, so there should be no cases where we are touching students in such a way as to move them unless we have that training, and unless there is danger. Professional ethics would be beneficial in this case because the sub would have known what he was expected to do in the cases where students would refuse to follow directions, or just known that he should not be touching students in the case that in the situation that happened. The next case is Flanagan versus Canton. The student was pushed by another student when they were entering the locker rooms. The parents sued the teacher because the teacher was not monitoring the students entering the locker rooms as they usually did, because they were dealing with another student who had behavior, and they were having a student conference with them to discuss the behaviors that had happened. The reactive measures would be to ensure the student receives medical attention as soon as possible, and to gather information from the teacher and the students during the incident to make sure that we have a full idea of what had happened. The proactive measures our school would take would be to establish a practice of setting rules and expectations with the students while they enter the locker rooms, as well as to perhaps provide additional supervisory aids to ensure that students are safe in the locker rooms when they are supposed to be. Professional ethics would be beneficial in this case because the teacher would have had the expectations set up with their students before the incident happened to ensure the safety of all students. Johnson Johnson versus the School of District of Millard. In this case, the student sustained injuries from a physical game taught in his music class while the teacher was not supervising sufficiently. These were very young students, and they were playing London Bridge, and they got very physical very quickly. The reactive measures would be to ensure the student receives medical attention as soon as necessary and gather information from the teacher and students during the incident. The student did end up getting stitches that, it tore the muscle in his face, and he had to get stitches that went all the way down to the bone. So he has permanent physical injuries from this incident. The proactive measures our school would take would be to establish a practice of I do, we do, you do when going over activities, especially when they involve getting physical with other students, and especially with younger students, because they still have a hard time with controlling their own strength and the movements of themselves, especially when it affects others. Professional ethics would be beneficial in this case because the teacher would have had an idea of how important it is to supervise younger children playing new physical games. The next case is Munn versus Hotchkiss School. In this case, a student was bitten by a tick while hiking on a school trip and became extremely sick. As a result, she actually got encephalitis from the tick bite, which is a very concerning medical issue that it takes a very long time to recover from. The reactive measures that we would take to ensure the student would receive medical attention as soon as necessary, or as soon as possible, and gather information from the teacher and students during the incident, as well as revise or go over the expectations that the school district put out prior to the field trip. The proactive measures our school would take would be to establish a practice of giving as much information as possible to parents and ensuring our students are wearing appropriate clothing on field trip. Professional ethics would be beneficial in this case because the parents would have been fully informed through the full disclosure regarding the risks to students, as well as as required by the Code of Ethics. The issue was that parents were not made aware that there were ticks in this area, and the student was not wearing appropriate clothing and did not have any bug spray or anything like that. So I think these would be a good way to circumvent that. The last case that I found was Mitchell versus Cedar Rapids Community School District. In this case, a special needs student left campus during the day with another special needs student and was sexually assaulted at a private residence. The reactive measures would be to ensure the students are separated, the female student receives the medical attention necessarily as soon as possible, and to gather information from the people who had witnessed interactions between the students around the time preceding the incident. The proactive measures our school would take would be to establish a practice of closely monitoring relationships involving the special needs students and to ensure that parents are fully aware of the goings-on, simply because these are still minors, they are still children, and they need an extra level of protection to ensure that they are not taken advantage of by anyone else. Professional ethics would be beneficial in this case because the teacher should have disclosed the relationship between the students as it did pose a risk. And here are my works cited.